Hello, class. Dr. Bauer's office hours. Let's talk about some objections to utilitarianism. Here's some study guide questions. 1. What's the general standard strategy for objecting to utilitarianism? 2. How might someone object to utilitarianism by appealing to rights? 3. How might someone object to utilitarianism by appealing to promises? 4. How might someone object to utilitarianism by appealing to virtue? 5. How might someone object to utilitarianism by appealing to knowledge? 6. How might someone object to utilitarianism by appealing to existence? Okay, and as always, you want to follow along with a pencil and a piece of paper or a laptop or something to take notes on so that you can fill out the answers to these study guide questions as we proceed. Now, utilitarianism, if you remember, is the view that says that the only thing which contributes to the moral quality of an action is the results in terms of how much pleasure or pain it causes in the affected parties. Right? An action, in other words, is as morally good as the amount of pleasure it causes in the affected parties, and an action is morally bad as much as it causes pain in the affected parties. And that's what we covered in the preceding lecture. If you want to object to utilitarianism in general, one good strategy is to think of something that matters independently of happiness. Right? Something whose value is not easily translatable in terms of pleasure. Something that might matter independently of whether it makes you feel good. Then, once you've got that thing in mind, put together a situation in which that thing is more important than the total pleasure of everyone affected. Now, that's a very abstract description of things, so let's take a few concrete and very well-known cases that are problems for utilitarian philosophers. The first one is the notion of rights. Consider the idea that because I am so unpopular on YouTube that there is a public outcry for my imprisonment. People just hate me so much that they want me locked up and perhaps even tortured. Don't get any ideas. Anyway, if it caused people enough pleasure, if my imprisonment resulted in a total maximization of pleasure all around the world, if people were just so overjoyed to see me imprisoned, then that might outweigh the individual misery that I would have, my sadness, my upset at being imprisoned. Right? If you imagine a situation where someone who's very, very, very unpopular and you consider their imprisonment to be something that causes a whole lot of joy, more total pleasure than pain, more total happiness, then the utilitarian would say, yeah, imprison them. Duh, lock up the unpopular person if it makes everyone else happy. But what's wrong with thinking that way? I bet you can imagine what's wrong with it is you shouldn't lock up an innocent person. Innocent people have a right not to be imprisoned. The idea of a right is something that matters regardless of whether it makes anyone happy. Rights are not supposed to be negotiable depending on whether people like them. Rights can't be weighed against the total pleasure of everyone affected. They're these things that kind of matter no matter what. Sometimes we find utilitarian debates about rights that we recognize already. Some people may ask, is freedom of speech something that is valuable no matter what? Or, based on the total pleasure and pain of people affected, maybe certain types of speech should be curtailed. But, to the extent that freedom of speech is a right, well, that means that it's something to uphold regardless of how people feel about it. So let's object to utilitarianism by appealing to the notion of rights this way. First, if utilitarianism is true, then it is legitimate and proper to lock up a celebrity just because they are sufficiently unpopular. But 2, it's not legitimate or proper to lock up a celebrity simply because they're sufficiently unpopular. You can't just lock someone up because a whole lot of people hate them and no other reason. They have to deserve it. So, utilitarianism is not true. That's one way to object to utilitarianism. We use the notion of rights and we say, look, common sense says that rights matter more than total happiness. Utilitarianism says that total happiness matters more than rights. So much the worse for utilitarianism. That's the objection. And it's not just rights that the utilitarian has trouble with. Consider the notion of a promise, right? If you promise to do something, that's not something that you can later decide not to do because of the total amount of happiness that results. Maybe you promise to feed your friends fish while they're away. And while they're away, you decide, I don't really want to feed their fish. Actually, when you consider the effort it takes to feed their fish, and the gas that it costs to go out there, and the risk of making the journey, it's really just total amount of pain goes up, pleasure goes down. You know what would really maximize pleasure is don't take care of their fish. Just wait for it to die and whatever. And as soon as your friend is about to come back, then quickly replace it with a fish that they won't know, they won't be able to distinguish from their own, right? That way would result in less effort, less cost, overall utility, overall pleasure goes up, right? So don't keep your promise. Wait a minute. So here we have another sort of objection to utilitarianism. Utilitarianism, remember, it only pays attention to how happy everyone is made as a result of a certain decision. So if breaking a promise is going to make everyone happier, the utilitarian would say, go ahead and break that promise. In a way, it's like the utilitarian doesn't believe in promises at all, right? If every single promise that you make is something that you can later reevaluate and decide not to keep if it just makes more people happy, that's not really having a promise. That's not even making them. You're just saying that you promise things and then not really keeping them. Even if keeping your promise is something that causes the overall pleasure of affected parties to go down, well, you still promised to do that thing. If you promise to tell someone the truth about their artwork that they're about to show to you or let you listen to, and then you don't tell the truth just because you want to make sure everyone stays as happy as possible, not only have you failed to keep a promise, but we would ordinarily think that that was wrong. You're supposed to tell the truth if you promised it. So here's a way to object to utilitarianism by using the notion of promises. We say, 1, if utilitarianism is true, then it's legitimate and proper to break a promise if it just makes everyone a little bit happier. But, according to common sense, it's not legitimate or proper to break a promise just because it makes everyone else a little happier. So, utilitarianism is wrong. That's the objection to utilitarianism that appeals to promises. Another topic that utilitarians wrestle with is the topic of virtue. Now, virtue is a very poetic sounding word, and it's used in a few different ways, some of them religious, some of them ethical. When we talk about virtue, we mean a positive personality trait or a positive character trait that helps you do what you ought to do, helps you be how you ought to be. We might say courage is a virtue. Right? Courage is a character trait that's positive, that helps you be how you ought to be. Or honesty is a virtue. Honesty is a positive character trait, and if you have it, it helps you be how you're supposed to be. Or perhaps temperance, being able to control yourself, right? That could be a positive feature that helps you be how you're supposed to be, right? And other things too, right? Being kind, right? Being kind, being courageous, being sympathetic, being temperate, all of these could be being wise, right? These are all virtues. They're positive personality traits that help you be how you're supposed to be, virtues. Here's the thing about virtues. Just because you have them doesn't always make you happier, it seems. Consider the virtue of kindness, right? That virtue of really feeling for other people and being sympathetic to them and considering their plight, right? If you have that virtue, you are often distressed. You're distressed because you're feeling for all the people who are suffering in the world. You cannot help but be sympathetic to all of the injustice that there is, and you get so upset and you get so mad about it, and you get upset and you get so mad because you're virtuous, because you care about justice, because you're kind. An unsympathetic person, maybe even a callous person, someone without virtue, they're not as bothered, you know? They won't feel as much distress. They won't feel as much pain. Now consider, should we have a world that's full of kind, sympathetic people? Or should we have a world that has mostly callous people and maybe just a minimal amount of kind people to get stuff done, right? Should we have a few kind people or all kind people? Which is a better world? You'd think that a world of all kind people would be the better world. But from a utilitarian perspective, no. Because in the world where everyone is kind, that's a world where you have a lot of people who are concerned, a lot of people who are very, they're feeling for one another. And by the way, when you consider this world with all kind people, don't go thinking that just because everyone is kind doesn't mean the world would be perfect. Kind people often feel for each other when you don't even need to, right? Someone's going in for surgery. The surgery's good for them. I have no reason to feel bad for them, but I go, ooh, surgery, right? That's a little bit of distress that I felt, and it didn't really do anyone any good. And it's something that kind people feel a lot, right? So you might think this, look, a world full of virtuous people is better, right? Common sense says that a world full of virtuous people is better. But according to utilitarianism, a world full of virtuous people would not be better. You should have some callous people in there too to make sure that, so that things aren't too painful. So much the worse for utilitarianism, we'd say. Or at least that's how the objection would go if you're appealing to the idea of virtue to object to utilitarianism. Note that for the utilitarian, it doesn't matter what kind of person is happy, whether they're a mean, nasty person or a nice, sympathetic person, as long as they're happy, right? It's the happiness that matters, not where it comes from or who's got it. Maybe easier to understand is the way that you might appeal to the idea of knowledge to object to the utilitarian. Knowledge can be painful. There are some things that it hurts to know, or it's a painful truth. You wish you didn't find out, it just makes you sad to know that. And this raises the question, is it okay to be blissfully ignorant? If you don't know anything about the world, if you're completely oblivious to all of the unfairness, all of the pain, all of the suffering, all of the injustice, and all of the problems, if you don't know about any of that, you're probably a lot happier than if you know about all of it. So, is that a reason to not know about any of it? Is that a reason to be ignorant? Should we say, that's how you should live, don't know anything, because you'll be happier? Well, no, we tend not to think that way. But when you look at the utilitarian philosophy in its very simplest form, it looks like they're saying this. Really, knowledge is not something that's good. It's only good if it overall makes people happier. But how about this? One of your relatives doesn't know yet that a loved one has been killed. They don't have to know. They could go the rest of their life being happy, thinking that this loved one far off is enjoying life. They don't usually come in contact with this loved one, and so it's easy to keep the secret from them. Should you tell them that their loved one died? Or should you let them be blissfully ignorant? The utilitarian would say, no, don't tell them. If it just makes them sad, why should they know the truth? But it seems like, according to common sense, maybe you should tell them, right? Is honesty important? Common sense seems to say that yes, honesty does matter, but utilitarianism will say the truth only matters if it overall increases the amount of pleasure, if it makes overall everyone happier. So we might object to this, that if utilitarianism is correct, then knowledge is only valuable to the extent that it makes people happy. But, we might object from the perspective of common sense, knowledge is valuable regardless of whether it makes people happy. So, utilitarianism is not correct. That's the way to object to utilitarianism, by appealing to the idea of knowledge. Finally, and perhaps most metaphysically, let's consider the idea of existing at all. Is existence a good thing? Weird question to ask, especially when you selectively attend to the question, in other words, apart from considerations of whether your existence is going well. Never mind whether your existence is going well or going poorly. Just existing at all, the mere fact of existing, is that a good thing? Is it good to be? Let's sharpen the question. Here you have world A. In world A, there is exactly a neutral amount of pleasure and pain. There's some pleasure, there's some pain, so it overall cancels out to 0. There's exactly enough pain in world A to cancel out the amount of pleasure in world A. Some good, some bad. That's world A. Maybe it's our world. World B is empty. It's lifeless, non-existent. There's no pleasure, and there's no pain. There's nothing in there. Nothing breathes, lives, creeps, flies, experiences. It's just empty void. Which of these worlds is better? This one? Well, according to the utilitarian, it's not necessarily so. In fact, if you look at the utilitarian philosophy, it seems like there's no moral difference between them. The moral value of world A is 0. Pleasure and pain, 0 out, 0. And the moral value of world B, also 0. So, according to utilitarianism, to be or not to be, same thing. Well, I mean, in this specific circumstance, at least. Let's take this world A and world B and object to utilitarianism this way, right? If utilitarianism is correct, then a world without any life at all is no worse than a world with some pleasure and some pain. But according to common sense, a world with some pleasure and some pain is much better than a lifeless world. So, utilitarianism is not correct. That's the way to object to utilitarianism, by appealing to the idea of existence, a very metaphysical objection. So those are a few standard sorts of objections to utilitarianism. I hope that you've noticed that they all fall under a certain kind of pattern, right? That you first consider something that seems to be valuable independently of happiness, and then you just imagine a situation where common sense would say, yeah, that thing is more important than the happiness that the utilitarian would be chasing. And there, you've got your objection, right? Find something that matters independently of happiness, cobble together a situation where the utilitarian would go one way and common sense goes the other, and there you've got your objection. Now, not all objections to utilitarianism fit this pattern. Some of them are more elaborate and have led to other bits of philosophy of their own that are quite interesting. When we come back next time, we're going to look at one of those, The Experience Machine by Robert Nozick. See you next time.